Okay, welcome to the sign-up seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Giulia Fanti. Giulia is an assistant professor of PCE. She received her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, under an NSF fellowship. And her research is in algorithmic foundations of blockchain, distributed systems, privacy-preserving technologies, and machine learning. Giulia has received the Best Paper Award at ACM Sigmatics for her research, and is a fellow of the World Economic Forum on Global Future Council on Cybersecurity. Giulia, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm very happy to be here. Special thank you to Jamie for the desperate last-minute invitation. So today I'm going to be talking to you about compounding of wealth in proof-of-stake cryptocurrencies. And this was joint work with a number of collaborators, Leonid Kogan, Siwong Oh, Kathy Ruan, who's an undergrad here at CMU, Pramod Vishwanath, and Giulia Wang. And this is work that will be appearing soon at Financial Crypto this year. Okay, so Bitcoin at this point has been around a little bit over 10 years. So, and since its inception, it has evolved from kind of an abstract idea, research idea, to something very practical. So a lot of major companies today are releasing products related to blockchains. And in kind of a pinnacle achievement, Kentucky Fried Chicken Canada recently announced that they're accepting Bitcoin as payment for fried chicken. So despite this kind of tremendous growth in the last decade, still today, we aren't really paying for our groceries with Bitcoin. We're not using Bitcoin for everyday transactions, or at least that's probably true for most of the people in this room. So why is that? So does anyone have any ideas on why Bitcoin hasn't become more widespread?
Value instability.
Okay, that's my first one. High volatility. Okay, so the price of Bitcoin is extremely unstable, and a lot of merchants are unwilling to accept it as payment because they're worried that tomorrow those Bitcoins will be worth nothing. Okay. Anything else? Yeah?
It's not scalable at a layer 1 level.
It's not scalable. Okay, so that's my third one. Okay, scalability challenges. And a lot of merchants that my collaborators and I have talked to are also worried about PR concerns. So a lot of merchants perceive Bitcoin as something that only criminals use and don't want to be associated with it. Okay, and on the scalability front, we have Bitcoin is extremely slow, so it can process something like 7 transactions per second. Latencies are on the order of hours. Okay, so if your Visa credit card took hours to confirm, nobody would be using it. Right? So there's a number of factors that contribute to why Bitcoin is not taken off more than it has. And I'm interested in particular in the scalability challenges. So before I get into that, let's try to understand a little bit more why Bitcoin is not scalable. Okay. So Bitcoin solves the fundamental problem in blockchains, which is what is the next sequence in a distributed ledger? Okay, so we're trying to maintain a sequence of events in a distributed system, so everybody should agree on it, even in the presence of adversarial players. Okay? So this is the core consensus question that blockchains are trying to solve. And Bitcoin addresses this with a technique called proof of work. Okay? So let's suppose that we have some number of nodes that are participating in the network. Okay? And each node has a different fraction of computational power. So the blue guy has 15% of the computational power, red guy has 40%. Okay? So in proof of work, we want to select one of these miners with probability proportional to the amount of computational power that they hold. Okay? And the way that this is achieved is by giving each of them a puzzle, okay, their own puzzle, that they have to solve, which is basically brute forcing a hash function. Okay, so they need to find some value x, some nonce, such that the hash of x concatenated with the last block in the blockchain concatenated with the node's ID should be less than or equal to some threshold. Okay? And because of the randomness in these puzzles that are being given to the different nodes, the outcome, the winner of this race, is going to be random and is selected with probability proportional to their fraction of computation. Okay, so let's suppose that the yellow node wins this race. Upon winning this race, the yellow node gets to propose a block that goes onto the blockchain. And in exchange for proposing this block, the yellow node gets a reward. Yes?
What exactly is the race between the nodes? You're saying it wins the race. What race?
So these nodes are all trying to find an X, and the first node that finds an X gets to propose the next block.
Oh, so when you said that you're selecting a node with probability proportional to its capacity, I thought you meant that you first select a node and then ask it to solve this.
No. You select the node by asking them to solve this, and the node that first solves this puzzle is considered the winner, is the one that gets to propose the next block. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay.
They all get asked simultaneously.
They all get asked simultaneously, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so in this example, the yellow node solved the puzzle first and therefore gets to propose the block and also gets an associated reward. Okay? So this reward is the incentive mechanism that incentivizes these miners to actually participate in this game, because otherwise they would just be burning energy needlessly. Okay, so if we do this again, now let's say the red node wins, the red node gets a reward, and so forth. Okay, so the process continues like this. And the thing to notice here is that in order to select the next proposer, this is burning a lot of energy. Okay? So you can find all kinds of articles on the internet right now saying that Bitcoin alone is burning more energy than the entire country of Ireland or various like first world nations, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And that's because they're all of the miners are trying to brute force this hash function so that they can be the next proposer and get the associated reward. Okay. So because of these intense energy requirements, a new class of consensus access control protocols called proof of stake has recently emerged, or POS. So proof of stake works conceptually in a very similar way. So let's suppose that we have now just two parties, Alice and Bob. Again, we want to pick one of these with probability proportional to the amount of resources that they have. But now the resource is not computational power, but it's stake, or the number of tokens that they have in the system. So let's suppose that Alice has 1 token and Bob has 2. Now Alice is going to be chosen with probability 1/3, and Bob gets chosen with probability 2/3. Okay? And how that happens, I'm not going to talk about. You can accomplish this with verifiable random functions or certain cryptographic constructions. So let's suppose that we pick Alice. Okay, now Alice gets to propose the next block, and she gets a reward in exchange. Now we need to update the fractions of stake that each of these have. So now Alice has 1/2 and Bob has 1/2. Okay, so we do this again. Alice now gets 3/5 of the stake, and Bob has 2/5. So notice that Alice's fraction of stake is increasing the more blocks she gets. Okay, and now if Bob wins, he equalizes it at 1/2, 1/2. Okay. So notice here that the more money you have in a proof of stake system, the more likely you are to get elected as the next proposer, okay? Which in turn gives you more rewards, which in turn makes you even more likely to get elected in the future. Okay, so this has a compounding effect, just like compounding in investments. Okay? Yes?
But isn't this also true with proof of work in the sense that when you get a reward, after some point you can buy more mining equipment, you get a higher percentage of the staking
Okay.
of the mining computation?
Good question. The question is, doesn't this also happen in proof of work? Because the more rewards you get, you can eventually maybe buy another mining rig. Okay? And that is true. You can do that, but it's a lot more, it's not as explicit as in proof of stake. So in proof of stake, this is happening inherently. It's part of the protocol. Whereas in proof of work, you actually have to go out and expend those resources, make a conscious decision. So that's kind of this distinction here. Okay, so yes?
So is it technically
of work, if you have more resources, your probability of solving the problem also becomes more faster. It's a high probability of solving the problem.
Yes, but that probability doesn't increase the more blocks that you get.
In theory, yes, but in practice, I think.
In practice, because of what he said, that can happen. That's right. So we're focusing on proof of stake in this work, in part because it's more explicit, it's a cleaner problem, but you could look at similar issues in proof of work. Okay. So in the last couple of years, there's been a common trend of existing cryptocurrencies transforming their proof of work blockchain into a proof of stake one. So even Ethereum has announced plans to transition from proof of work to proof of stake, or new blockchains popping up that are using proof of stake. And typically what they do is they transition to proof of stake while using the same block reward mechanism as they would previously use in proof of work. And so kind of the main message of this talk is that if you do this naively, it's a bad idea. It can lead to some pretty severe repercussions. So in this talk, I'll have 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about why combining traditional block rewards with proof of stake is a bad idea. It can lead to severe stake imbalance, which has negative security repercussions. In the second part, I'm going to talk about a solution that we propose called geometric rewards. So this is an alternative block reward function that minimizes this problem. And we show that geometric rewards are optimally fair. They're also universal, so they don't depend on the initial conditions of your cryptocurrency. And they are, in some sense, the opposite of what's currently done. And in the third part of the talk, I'll talk about some practical implications and how our work can be used to inform the design of existing or new cryptocurrencies. Okay, so let's start with part 1. So what really is the problem here? Okay, so before digging into this, let's step back a second and look at the pros and cons of proof of work versus proof of stake. So proof of work is good because it has relatively good security and robustness. It's kind of amazing that Bitcoin works as well as it does, given that it was an idea that was just kind of proposed in a somewhat ad hoc way. The cons are that it's very energy inefficient, it's slow, and it also leads to some centralization of power. So in practice, the number of miners that are actually controlling Bitcoin's blockchain is very small. So if you were to start mining on your laptop, the chance of you ever getting a block is minuscule. Okay? Now, if we look at proof of stake, the pros are that it's energy efficient. Okay? So it doesn't require this whole solving of puzzle issue. But the cons are, first of all, that we don't really understand the security properties of proof of stake very well. It's much more subtle than proof of work. And second, it has this issue of the rich getting richer. This compounding effect that we talked about. So some of you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with the rich getting richer? And there's a few answers to this. So one issue that people bring up is ethical concerns. Okay, so a lot of people in the blockchain community feel that the rich getting richer kind of goes against the entire idea and ethos behind blockchains, which was to decentralize power. Okay. Another lower level, more pragmatic concern is security concerns. Okay, so it turns out that if the rich get too rich, then your blockchain no longer can give any security properties at all. And so that's a big problem. So to show why security can't be preserved, I'm going to quickly describe what's called a 51% attack. Okay, so this attack was initially proposed in the context of proof of work and Bitcoin, but the same idea applies to proof of stake. Okay, so let's suppose that we have 2 pools of miners. We have honest miners who control 49% of the stake in the system, or of the, let's say, computational power. And we have an adversarial group of miners that control 51%. Okay? And this attack proceeds as follows. The adversary is going to let the honest guys build their own blockchain in peace, and it's not going to participate in theirs. It's going to use all of its computational resources to build a private chain on the side. Okay? And because the adversary has more computational power than the honest party, this red chain is growing at a faster rate than the yellow chain. Okay, so with probability 1, eventually it will become longer than the yellow chain. Okay. So once the red chain becomes longer than the yellow chain, it can be released. And now the honest parties, by protocol, are going to adopt the longest chain visible to them. Okay, so they'll say, okay, red chain is longer, that's the true ledger, I'm going to start building on the red chain. Okay. So what's the problem with this? Well, the adversary could do the following. Let's say the adversary wants to buy a Ferrari. Okay, so the adversary pays, I don't know, $1 million, I don't know how much Ferraris cost, $1 million to a car dealer, and puts that transaction in the yellow chain. The car dealer accepts the transaction, gives the adversary the Ferrari, and both of them are happy. Now, let's say 2 months from now, the adversary releases their longer red chain with a conflicting transaction, TX prime, that says, actually, those $1 million were paid back to me. Okay? So now, since all of the honest nodes are adopting this red chain, all of the honest nodes perceive TX prime as the true transaction. And so the adversary now has both the Ferrari and the $1 million, and the car dealer has nothing. Okay, so this is a double spend attack that is enabled by the 51% attack. Okay? So for a long time, these 51% attacks were perceived as kind of a theoretical concern. Who would actually control 51% of the computational power? But actually, in the last couple of years, 51% attacks have become an increasing problem. So we're seeing a lot more instances of 51% attacks. And in fact, just last year, some hackers stole $18 million through a 51% attack on Bitcoin Gold. Okay? So this is a really pragmatic concern. And if we go back to our proof of stake setting, we were talking about why is compounding bad? Why is it bad that the rich get richer? Well, the concern here is that the rich could start with some reasonable fraction, like say a third, and through compounding could actually exceed some problematic threshold, like 1/2. Okay? So that's what we're worried about. So just how rich do the rich get in proof of stake? So to try to answer this, we started by modeling proof of stake blockchains as follows. We're going to assume that we have 2 parties, Alice and Bob. All of these results can be extended to arbitrarily many parties. And we assume that we have a discrete time system, where each time slot corresponds to a single block. Okay? We're also going to assume that all nodes participate in the system, and we don't have nodes coming and going, so the set of participants is fixed. Now I'm going to introduce some notation, and I'll remind you what this notation means later, but just to introduce it. We're going to use SA of n to denote Alice's stake at time n, and VA of n to denote Alice's fraction of stake at time n. And I'll remind you of these later. S of n is going to be the total stake at time n, S for stake, and R of n is going to be the block reward at time n, it's R for reward. Okay. So just looking at this example, let's suppose Alice starts with 2 coins and Bob starts with 1. SA of 0 is going to be 2, and SB of 0 is going to be 1. Okay, and then at the first block, we're handing out 1 unit of reward. So we increment Alice's pool by 1. Bob stays the same. Same for the second time step. And in the third time step, Bob gets the reward, and so we increment SB of n. Okay, and the assumption here is that at each time step, we're choosing the next proposer with a probability proportional to their fraction of stake at that time. Okay, so if we look at n equals 3, Alice has 4 tokens, Bob has 2. So Alice has 2/3 of the stake. So we're going to pick the next proposer with probability proportional. We're going to pick Alice with probability 2/3. Okay, yes?
So this time there is no race, right? You're actually...
This time there's no race. We've abstracted away the race. We're actually we're drawing one of these proposers with probability 2/3. Okay, is the model clear? Okay. So under this model, let's look at a toy example. Let's suppose that we initialize our system with Bitcoin's initial parameters. Okay? So Bitcoin started with 50 tokens, and each block reward was also 50 tokens. Okay? So let's suppose that Alice starts with 1/3 of the stake. So VA of 0 is 1/3. And here I'm showing you the distribution of her stake. Okay, so in the beginning, it's an impulse because we're imposing that Alice has exactly 1/3. But we're going to track this distribution over time as we run our proof of stake model for n steps. So it turns out that you can actually characterize this distribution for proof of stake exactly because it's just a Polya earn process. And it turns out that this distribution converges to a beta distribution that looks like this blue curve. Okay? So this blue curve should look a little scary to you. Okay? So what is this saying? It's saying even if Alice started with 1/3 of the stake, she could end up with all of the stake, or she could end up with none of the stake as n tends to infinity. Okay? This is kind of weird because if you're putting in 1/3 of the stake, you should expect to get, on average, at least 1/3 of the rewards. But this is showing that in practice that can be very different, that can vary a lot. Okay? And let's compare this to what happens in proof of work. So here I'm assuming that in proof of work, if you get rewards, you're not using those rewards to buy more mining rigs. Okay? That would change the results. But if we just assume in proof of work that at each time slot, Alice is winning with probability 1/3 because she has 1/3 of the computational power, then this distribution is just going to be a binomial with parameter 1/3 over n trials. Okay, so in particular, this distribution is concentrating. It's getting closer and closer to 1/3 the larger n gets. Okay? So at least qualitatively looking at this, it seems like proof of work is more fair than proof of stake. And I'm going to formalize that notion in a little bit. And I want to highlight one thing. This is happening not because Alice is doing anything adversarial. She's following protocol. This is happening just because of stake compounding and because of randomness in the protocol. Okay? So the message here is that if you initialize a proof of stake system naively, you can get very severe imbalance in your stake distributions. So in part 2, we're going to ask, how do we fix this problem? How can we make this more fair? Yes?
Can I ask you a question? How independent is that scary probability distribution on the initial assumptions? And I ask because the initial assumptions seem reasonable for proof of work, where you assume things will balance out because everyone's maybe you have 3 people and they're all contributing 1/3 of the work, right? So I would expect it to concentrate. But with proof of stake, winning one thing gives you 3 times as much as you started with.
Yeah.
Right. So that seems like a crazy place to start with.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you start with a reward of maybe 1% of the total stake, or 0.1%, do you still get this crazy distribution?
Okay, good question. The question is, how much does this depend on your initial conditions? And the answer is actually a lot, so for the reason that you pointed out. And I'm going to talk about this at kind of the latter half of the presentation. So some of the results in our paper are to quantify how much does this depend on your initial conditions. And we have a procedure that allows you to figure out if you want a certain equitability, how should you initialize your system? So we'll get to that in a little bit. Thanks. Yes?
So the number of tokens that each node has, is there a way that they can pretend that is something else than the true value?
They can pretend for it to be lower, but they cannot pretend for it to be higher. Okay, so in practice, the way that this works is if I have, like, let's say 10 tokens, I'm going to check for each of those tokens, does that get to be a proposer in the next time step? And Bob is doing that for his 5 tokens. So I could choose to only check 5 of my tokens, but I only have at most 10 tokens, so I can't pretend that I have more than 10. Does that make sense?
So they cannot make an attack by pretending to have more tokens.
That's right. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Another one of the assumptions was that the pool of participants was fixed,
Yeah.
which is pretty common in proof of work because the cost to entry is pretty high. But one of the goals also of proof of stake is that, 32 ether, for instance, you can, it's the idea is that more people can participate, right? So how does that play with the rest of the
Yeah.
play?
So the assumption that the stake pool is fixed is certainly a simplification, right? It might not hold in practice. This was done mostly to make the analysis tractable, and that's a direction that we would like to pursue in the future. Okay. So how do we fix this problem? Well, the first step is to actually define a quantitative metric so that we can compare different protocols. Okay? So if we're looking at this plot, maybe a natural first attempt at defining a metric would be to look at the mean. Okay, so if I put in 1/3, then on average I should get out 1/3 of the rewards. But looking at this distribution, at these two distributions, is the mean actually different between them? The answer is no. Okay, so this might not be obvious at first, but you can show this by showing that the evolution of the stake fraction is actually a martingale, and so the expectation is equal to the initial value. Okay? So the mean is not a good metric for stake imbalance. So what we did instead was the following. We're going to choose a time horizon, big T. Okay? This is going to be we're going to call this an epoch length. And we're going to compare reward functions, R1 and R2, by saying if we have two reward functions that give out the same total number of tokens over our epoch length, so the sum of all of these RNs are equal, then we say R1 is more equitable than R2 if R1 has a smaller variance at time t. The fraction of stake has a smaller variance. Okay, so remember, these fractions of stake are random variables, so it makes sense to talk about the variance of it. Okay? So that's our metric. So if we go back to the previous slide, we would say that proof of work is more equitable than proof of stake because it has a smaller variance. Step 2 is that we're going to define our design space. Okay, so we constrain the problem such that we're giving out a total of R tokens for every epoch. And that's something that the system designer can choose. And our goal is to maximize equitability. And we're going to do this by changing the reward function R of n. Yes?
In the previous slide, is there any reward function for which, so what I'm saying is that could you have R1 and R2 such that the variance is smaller for some participants and larger for the others? Good question.
It turns out that It turns out that the answer is no, and I'll show you later why that is. Okay, so the knob that we're turning here to improve equitability is the reward function. So just to give you an example, let's look here at the reward function for Bitcoin. Okay? So Bitcoin uses what's called a halving schedule. So for the first epoch, which would be like here, each epoch is about 4 years. For the first epoch, the reward function is constant. Between each epoch, we halve the amount of the reward. So they started at 50 and then went to 25, then 12.5. And so since we're interested in just a single epoch for now, we call this the constant reward function. Okay, so it's the total number of tokens given out in that period divided by the number of blocks in that period. Okay. And so recall, our goal is to change this reward function to achieve better equitability. So if we formulate our problem precisely, we have an optimization where we're minimizing the variance of our stake distribution. So this is our equitability. And we're minimizing over R, which is our reward function. And we impose two constraints. The first is that the amount of reward you give out per epoch is fixed. That's big R. And each reward is going to be non-negative. Okay, so you're never going to penalize someone for proposing a block. So this is our optimization problem. And it turns out that this problem has a very nice, clean solution. Okay? And that solution is what we call geometric rewards. So geometric rewards are defined like this, but I think an easier way to think about them is the following. If we assume that at the beginning of our epoch, we have one token in the pool, you can normalize it to whatever you want. But let's suppose we start with 1, and at the end of our epoch, we end with r plus 1 tokens because we gave out r during the epoch. The geometric reward interpolates between those 2 points with a geometrically increasing function. Okay, and that's why we call it geometric rewards. So to plot this for the same parameter values as Bitcoin, what you would get is this kind of funky looking figure with some very sharp increases for each epoch. Okay, so why would this be optimal? Right? So to try to understand this, it's useful to think about a common oversimplification that people make in the blockchain community, which is that the more tokens you have, the richer you are. Okay? And that is true if the total supply is fixed. But notice that these block rewards are really just inflation. Okay? So they're increasing the total supply of tokens. So what we should be thinking about is really the fiat value of each token. Okay? So for a short enough epoch, we can assume that the fiat value of a cryptocurrency is fixed. Okay? I mean, volatility and speculation aside, the actual value that it's providing is, let's say, fixed. So as you pump more tokens into the system, you're actually deflating the value of each individual token, right? So when we're thinking about the amount of block rewards, or the block reward function, in some sense, the proper way to think about this is what is the fiat value of each block reward? In other words, what is the amount of your block reward as a fraction of the total stake pool? Okay. So this plot is showing you the block reward as a fraction of the total stake pool amount for an example where we have 50 total blocks and we're giving out one token per block. Yes. And so as I think someone pointed out earlier, with constant rewards, in the beginning, you're giving out a larger fraction of the total pool. But as the epoch goes on, you're giving out less and less as a fraction of the total pool. And what geometric rewards are doing is actually giving out the same fraction at each block. Okay? So intuitively, the reason that this is optimizing the problem that I showed you earlier is because it's spreading out the randomness of block rewards across the epoch. Okay. So if we go back to the toy example that we talked about earlier, initialized with Bitcoin's parameters. So we had our scary blue curve for POS with constant rewards, and we have our proof of work curve, which is ideally what we would like to achieve. And it turns out that geometric rewards give you something in between. Okay? And I want to point out 2 things here. One is that geometric rewards significantly reduce the variance compared to constant rewards. But the second is that it's actually not possible to achieve the same equitability as proof of work. Okay? So there's a fundamental gap here between proof of stake and proof of work. And I should qualify that statement by saying our model of proof of stake does not describe every proof of stake system out there, but it is a fairly large chunk of them. Okay. So for those of you who are interested, I will very quickly give a proof sketch of why geometric rewards are optimal. So we use a result from Pimantle's 1990 paper on time-dependent Polya urns. And in particular, you can derive from his paper that if we define e to the theta n as the ratio of your total stake at time n over your total stake at time n minus 1, then you can express the equitability, or your normalized variance, like this. Okay? And the key point to notice here is that this expression on the right doesn't depend on your initial conditions at all. So that means when you optimize it, the same solution is going to be optimal for Alice and for Bob. So that gets at your question. So we can optimize the right-hand side here over theta n. So using some transformations, you get a concave optimization. You can use the KKT conditions to show that geometric rewards are optimal. Okay. Yes?
question about the effect of this on decentralization is that from the curve you showed in the previous slide, it seems like in proof of work, powerful people will always stay powerful because the thing is concentrated, and in proof of stake, they could go either way.
Yeah.
But by doing this, you're sort of reverting to the problem of powerful people staying powerful, right?
Yeah, so, okay, the question is maybe we want the variance to be very high because it allows people with very little power at the beginning to amplify their power by a lot. And that might be a case that you could make from an ethical standpoint, but from a security standpoint, we really don't want this right tail to be heavy. So. Okay, so some nice properties of geometric rewards. First of all, as I mentioned, this reward mechanism is optimal for everybody. Okay, so it optimizes Alice's variance and Bob's and however many parties you have in the system because of the fact that on this last slide, this right-hand side did not depend on the initial conditions at all. Okay. Another nice property is composition. So if you have lots of different epochs, the optimal solution is to use geometric rewards individually on each epoch. Okay, so that's nice because it means that you don't have to, the solution remains the same for each individual epoch and you can just apply it independently. Okay. So actually, all right, so what does this actually give us? So in this plot, I'm showing you, I'm assuming that we're going to fix the equitability that we can tolerate in our system. And here on the horizontal axis, we have big T, so the duration of our epoch. And on the vertical axis, we have the big R, which is the total rewards that we can give out in this epoch without exceeding our threshold equitability. And what this plot shows us, the blue curve is constant rewards, and the red curve is geometric. So by using geometric rewards, we can give out a lot more rewards per epoch without resulting in inequitable situations. Okay? So in particular, we get sub-exponential gains over constant rewards. Okay, so here sub-exponential I'm using to mean larger than polynomial but smaller than exponential. Okay? So geometric rewards really allow us to boost the amount of rewards that we can give out without ending up in problematic situations. So the message of this second part of my talk is that geometric rewards can counter some of the negative effects of compounding. And they are also optimally equitable for proof-of-stake systems. Okay. All right, so in the third part of this talk, I'm going to talk about some practical implications. So what can we actually do with this? Is the message that everyone should be using geometric rewards? Not necessarily. Okay. So to try to understand what is the practical landscape around this, I wanted to show you an excerpt from a lawsuit that was recently filed against Ripple, which is another cryptocurrency. And this lawsuit was filed by Coffey, who alleges that Ripple was selling unregistered securities. Okay? And this lawsuit says, unlike cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are mined by those validating transactions on their networks, all 100 billion of the XRP, that's Ripple tokens, in existence were created out of thin air by Ripple Labs at its inception in 2013. Okay? So this lawsuit is using the fact that Ripple pre-mined all of their tokens as evidence that they were unfairly advantaging certain individuals, namely themselves. So, all right, so Ripple is not proof of stake, so our results don't directly apply to this case, and in any case, I'm not eminently unqualified to comment on legal matters. But the point is, this issue of whether or not cryptocurrencies pre-mine all of their tokens is a contentious issue. Okay, so a lot of people in the blockchain community feel that it's unethical for cryptocurrencies to pre-mine most or all of their tokens. Okay? So what we have found in our work is that actually having a large initial stake pool helps to counter some of these compounding effects and equitability concerns. So there may be some security reasons for people to actually use larger stake pools. Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more. Let's suppose, so one thing that happens often with emerging cryptocurrencies is that they have foundations. Okay, and these foundations are basically in charge of the governance of the cryptocurrency. And what a lot of cryptocurrencies do is to allocate some fraction of the tokens to the foundation. Okay, so the foundation could hold, say, like 60 or 70% of the tokens. And this causes a lot of raised eyebrows, because obviously if you have one party that holds 60 or 70% of your tokens, then you have no security guarantees. Okay? But so a useful question to ask is, how big is too big? Okay? So if we have a foundation that starts with, say, a third of the tokens, how likely is it that they could boost their fraction to 1/2, at which point you no longer have security guarantees? So what our work allows you to do is to actually make some of these decisions about the initial stake pool size and fraction systematically. Okay? So the procedure would look something like this. The first thing you do is to choose your initial stake fraction that you're interested in. So like if we're thinking about a foundation that's controlling 1/3 of the stake, VA of 0 would be 1/3. Okay? And then we define kind of a problem threshold. Okay? So this is the threshold that we don't want to surpass in order to avoid having security problems. So if we're worried about a 51% attack, then tau would be 50%. Okay? Second step is that we choose gamma, which is the maximum tolerable probability of exceeding tau. Okay, so all of this is probabilistic, so we can't guarantee that you will never exceed tau, but we can say that it will happen with a very small probability that we can choose. Okay, so maybe gamma is 10 to the minus 6, for example. Step 3 is to choose our epoch length. And this is something that is, there's not a hard and fast rule for choosing an epoch length, but one reasonable choice might be the duration of your release cycle, so like maybe 6 months or something like that. Then we can now use Chebyshev's inequality to find the maximum allowable variance on VA of t. Okay, so VA of t, recall, was the fraction of stake that party A, Alice, holds at the end of our epoch. And if this variance is too large, then you're going to exceed our problem threshold tau with too big of a probability. Okay, so Chebyshev tells us that the variance should be at most some value. And then we can compute the trade-off, either analytically or numerically, between R, the total number of tokens that you can give out per epoch, and S0, the initial size of our stake pool that is allowable without causing problems. Okay? So just to give you an example of this, let's suppose that we have a foundation that holds 1/3 of the stake, or a party that holds 1/3 of the stake, and we don't want to exceed 1/2. That's our problem threshold. And we're willing to, and our tolerance is 10 to the minus 6. Okay? And arbitrarily, I chose an epoch length of 10,000 blocks here. So what this figure shows us is that if we want to be giving out 5,000 tokens during this epoch, we need at least, 40,000 tokens in our initial stake pool. Okay, so this is giving us a lower bound on the size of our initial stake pool. So this is and this is for constant rewards. You can do the same thing for geometric rewards. So the point is, this gives a very algorithmic step-by-step way for cryptocurrencies to choose their initial parameter settings in order to satisfy certain guarantees on equitability. Okay. Another issue that we looked at is strategic behavior. So some of you may have heard of selfish mining. So the idea here is that you can have adversarial parties that are not following protocol. So far we've assumed everyone was following protocol. But you can have parties that maintain many private forks. They could withhold blocks. They could release blocks late. So here in this example, these 2 side forks are private blocks that are being held by the adversary. And the honest party is always following protocol, so it's always building on the longest visible chain. Okay, so I won't go into detail here for time reasons, but we can show that under any adversarial strategy that falls in the constraints on the last slide, the reward, if the reward dispensed is some constant times t, some little c times t, then we can upper bound the variance of the adversary's stake at the end of the epoch, okay, with a constant that can be explicitly written in terms of the initial stake pool size, little c, and r, the total amount of tokens given out. Okay? And the point is, very simple strategies achieve this upper bound, or come close to this upper bound. And it turns out that geometric rewards actually don't really do better than constant rewards in terms of robustness to selfish mining or to these kinds of strategic attacks. So that seems to be a problem that needs to be addressed using other means, either by changing the consensus protocol or through other changes to the reward mechanism. So some downsides of geometric rewards are that you have large drops in the reward between epochs. And this can lead to attrition of participants. So remember, we saw this plot of the rewards that were kind of spiking up really sharply between epochs. When the reward goes from really high to very low, oftentimes you get miners leaving the system. And this is bad because it gives you worse security properties. Okay? And we've seen examples of this in like Dogecoin, for example. So I just mentioned that geometric rewards are also not robust to strategic behavior, things like selfish mining, so that's another problem. So in terms of practical takeaways, I think there's two possible strategies that are reasonable. One is to use geometric rewards only for the first epoch, because that is when a lot of these problems are most noticeable and most problematic. Another possibility is to just go ahead with constant rewards or whatever reward mechanism you're using, but use the techniques that I described to make sure that your initial setting, your initial stake pool size is large enough relative to the rewards that you're giving out. Yes?
So I'm thinking that I didn't understand something from earlier in your talk. What is an epoch?
Oh, sorry.
Is this something you developed for your purposes of your analysis, or is this a concept that's in blockchains today?
No, this was something that we defined for this paper. So the epoch is the time duration. So we're doing this optimization over a time window. Okay, so we said big T, we're looking at big T blocks, okay, a duration of big T blocks, and that time window we called an epoch.
I see. Okay. Is there any way to analyze the problem without a time window?
So it becomes not well defined, right? So you're optimizing. You would be optimizing over infinite functions, R of n.
You can't solve that by discounting or something like economists often do?
By discounting. So we did think about, basically you need some way to do an apples to apples comparison of different reward mechanisms. And we constrained this problem by saying we're going to fix the time window, and over this time window, we're going to look at all reward mechanisms that give out the same number of total tokens, big R. So if we had an infinite time window, you might be able to do something similar where you say the total number, where you consider only blockchains that give out a fixed total number of tokens. So cryptocurrencies with a capped token supply. You could say the total, the sum of all RNs for all time infinity should be less than or equal to this bound, big R. That complicates things a little bit. I think it's an interesting question. We just haven't solved that.
So cryptocurrencies frequently have a series of releases, right? So I guess I was sort of assuming that somehow the epochs are aligned with the releases.
Yeah, so that's one very natural way of defining your epoch length. Okay, so this is my last slide. So I wanted to leave you with 3 take-home messages. So the first is that if you initialize proof-of-stake cryptocurrencies poorly, you can have severe stake imbalance. And this is bad because it breaks security. It disincentivizes participants in the consensus protocol. And our work tries to formalize some of these notions and enable apples-to-apples comparisons between different reward mechanisms. The second take-home message is that starting with large stake pools mitigates these effects. It makes them less severe. And the third message is that geometric rewards are an optimally equitable reward mechanism that allows us to counter some of these effects, some of these compounding effects. Okay, so with that, I will take any questions. Yes?
Okay, so for proof of work, one very important security parameter is the actual fiat value of the currency. So for example, Bitcoin would go to $0 value, then it would have no security at all because no one would mine it.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think about how the fiat values and how it would change would affect your models?
So yeah, so for these calculations, we were assuming that the fiat value is fixed over the course of an epoch. So if that holds, then these results hold. If the value is changing over the course of an epoch, the results obviously change. So that's something that we haven't modeled. Yes?
Like, I guess security-wise, like how short can you make that epoch? Like if you want it to be, fiat value, like standard, could you divide that like 6-month epoch into, 6 smaller chunks?
Yeah.
Like that even more,
Yeah, you certainly could. Right, so there's trade-offs in both directions, right? So if you make the epoch length really short, then it's more likely that your valuation stays fixed, but then it also becomes harder for the system designers to choose big R, so to choose how many tokens they want to give out in that time period. So like let's say we have an epoch duration of 1 day. How are the system designers going to choose that on Monday we want to give out 100 tokens and on Tuesday we want to give out 200? It becomes a lot more kind of wishy-washy. So often system designers will choose some like long-term curve for how many tokens they want to be releasing over time. So for example, if they want a total fixed supply like Bitcoin, they might say, okay, we would like our token release to look like some curve that looks like this, or our total token supply to look like this, and those decisions could be made based on economic factors that are outside the model that we're discussing. The shorter you make your epoch duration, the harder it becomes to kind of justify these decisions. Yeah.
So 2 questions. The first one is that in both proof of stake and in proof of work, is there any way to prevent collusion between miners and like protect us from like 10 miners just coming together and pooling all their resources or pooling all their stake and pooling the show?
Good question. There is nothing preventing that, and well, okay, there kind of is. So this has actually happened. There are stake pools, and we analyze in our paper the effect of stake pools on compounding. So they actually help by reducing the variance for each individual node. But there have been a few instances of stake pools accumulating more than 50% of the mining power in Bitcoin, for example. And as soon as this happened, everybody freaked out and the price started crashing. So there's a bit of a reinforcement cycle that...
So then there was less incentive to collude because of the price crash.
Exactly, or at least less incentive to collude in a way that's detectable.
And the second question is that, again, following up on the point of like the variance reducing and leading to more centralization, is there like a sort of fundamental trade-off between, because you mentioned that reducing the variance is better for security purposes, is there a trade-off between decentralization and security per se?
Yeah, so a lot of people there's a lot of think pieces on various blog forums, whatever, talking about the fundamental trade-off between decentralization and security. I haven't seen this formalized for blockchain, for the kinds of problems that arise in blockchains. It seems very likely that there is this kind of trade-off, but it just hasn't been kind of precisely worked out, to the best of my knowledge. Anything else? Yes.
So there in a lot of these blockchains, we we see this sort of meta consolidation thing where individual miners collaborate in order to increase their collective odds of winning
Mhm.
the proof of work race.
Yeah.
And I imagine something similar can happen in proof of stake, although I haven't seen it documented. I'm wondering if you might want to design, instead of an equitable reward mechanism, a deliberately unfair reward mechanism that tried to drive everyone to, so that, I guess the property I want is everybody, every individual somehow has the same odds of winning the race no matter how many tokens they have.
Yeah, so the question is, would it be smarter to set up a system where everyone has the same probability of winning regardless of how many tokens they have? The challenge with doing this is that it tends to be very susceptible to Sybil attacks. So people can make a bunch of different accounts, and each account has the same probability of winning. So the more accounts you have, the better off you are. So actually, Brian Ford at EPFL has been working on a protocol called proof of personhood. So he wants one person, one vote. And I think the mechanism for achieving this is it requires some like in-person proof of personhood parties. So like you go to these parties and other people testify that you are indeed a person, and therefore you get a vote on the blockchain. I don't really understand the mechanism. I haven't read it carefully, but there are people who would really. I mean, that is kind of in some sense the goal. The problem is how to make this resistant to Sybil attacks.
It's proof of work where the work is kept as.
If you thought blockchain, if you thought Bitcoin was slow.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming.